So I'm dividing this chapter up into three main sections, just so, because it's throwing so much stuff at you that I think it might be helpful to have these broad designations to put things under. In this chapter, you ever have one of those aunts or uncles or cousins who has a bit of ADD when they're talking to you, and they're trying to bring you up to speed on everything that's happened? That's the way this chapter kind of feels. They're just like, and then there was this, and then there was this, and then there was this. So I think it's helpful to put these into these three categories. So, like I said before, and like the book points out, from the Depression through the years of World War II, conservative Protestantism fell into a period of cultural eclipse. And it doesn't really start to gain a lot of speed, at least in a national sense, until well after World War II. In academia, in the sort of intellectual centers of America, also early on in the media, as radio and television are becoming more and more important. For a long time, people of a sort of liberal bent tended to dominate. Conservatives tended to be sort of relegated to the backwoods, the rural areas, the late time sort of stuff. They were seen as being kind of retrograde, as not really having a lot to offer. That starts to change, and your book starts out by talking originally in terms of churches and worship, and noting the difference between the Holiness and Pentecostal denominations. And the Holiness and Pentecostal denominations, for the most part, until fairly recently, just sort of withdrew from larger American life. There were some reasons why that happened. One was, if you want to actually be a Holiness or Pentecostal Christian, you're going to be living according to a fairly strict moral code that's not going to allow you to participate in quite a few things that Americans started to see as more and more just what everybody would do. So you're probably not going to be dancing. You're probably not going to be listening to the radio for the contemporary music. You're probably not going to be going to the movie theater. So this tended to isolate them, and they were mostly okay with that. They saw the rest of American society is kind of fallen, and why would you want to be involved with them? Better to withdraw into your own community. Fundamentalists were more engaged with the larger community, like your book points out, as were evangelicals. So you get these two organizations: the National Association of Evangelicals, which was an attempt to bring together evangelicals all across the spectrum, and then you had the American Council of Christian Churches, and that was for fundamentalists. And remember, fundamentalists, evangelicals, not exactly the same thing. Fundamentalists, one of the key things that's differentiating them is not just believing that the Bible is literally true, but thinking that if somebody else doesn't hold to the fundamentals of Christian faith, you can't have any connection with them. You can't have any fellowship with them. Whereas evangelicals are more likely to say, well, you reach out to them. You evangelize them. So your book then talks about this guy who you've probably heard of, but his importance has declined in recent years, and that's Billy Graham. Graham is an interesting figure. He starts out as a very conservative Protestant, Presbyterian, and then he gets ordained as a Baptist minister, begins his career, bless him, as a worker for the Youth for Christ movement, and then he starts doing revival preaching. And you guys remember revivals are these very emotional, they're sort of a once in a while kind of experiences where people come together and they just get preached at for hours and hours, and the idea is to try to produce a conversion, try to produce, as not Billy Sunday, as Dwight Moody had it, the Sawdust Trail. Billy Graham expressed it in terms of the decision for Christ. So you're trying to produce this conversion experience in people. And his early preaching was very animated. It was pre-millennial. The end of the world is coming. You better reform quick. Better get good with Jesus quick, because you never know if this is the last chance that you have. As time goes on, he starts to get more and more moderate in that. Before that, though, he ends up not only doing all these revivals that he calls crusades, but also developing a radio program. Why is that important? Think about, the 1940s and 50s. Why was radio so important? Yeah.
Because he could preach to more people than he could physically get in contact with.
Yeah. Even with like a megaphone, a radio, you're reaching people nationwide. And radio, sort of like television, sort of like, how many of us actually watch network television today? Probably not that many. We tend to watch on, Netflix, Hulu, things like that, right? But you do get together and talk with your friends about what you've seen, don't you? I hope. Because that's part of the fun of watching shows, isn't it? Same thing happens with radio. It creates a community. And he's sort of at the nexus of that. He associated himself, and this is a good stance to take in the 1950s, with militant anti-communism. And he develops this real public prominence that eventually gets him into not becoming a politician himself, but gets him into the political arena so that he's, meeting Dwight Eisenhower and then each of Eisenhower's successors. So Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. And he was actually pretty close to Nixon until Nixon, it was revealed that he indeed was a crook. You guys remember that famous line, "I'm not a crook," and then it turns out that he is. One of the other problems that he had that your book talks about, which makes good sense, have any of you ever listened to these Watergate tapes? Not only does Nixon reveal that all this dirty stuff is going on, he swears. He uses foul, filthy language. And that's part of what Graham had a problem with. So Graham now realizes he's got to distance himself a bit from these direct political involvements. And eventually he ends up, like your book says, developing a message that can be understood as a moderate ecumenical evangelicalism. So that's one thing going on. Then your book talks about what happened in the South. And the crisis in the South over segregation brought about resistance. And this took the form of Christian academies. And Christian academies were basically a code word for all white schools in the South to avoid segregation, or avoid desegregation, sorry. Not to avoid segregation, to maintain segregation. There were some universities associated with conservative Protestantism that fit into that. Bob Jones University would be an example of that. They were militantly for segregation. Not everybody went that way. Some of the evangelicals, particularly younger people, started to argue that liberal ideas of social justice were compatible with a traditional theology. And your book gives a couple examples of this. One is the Jesus people of the 60s and the 70s, who are going to lead to the new paradigm churches that we'll talk about under this framework. Another is the Campus Crusade for Christ and its rival or partner, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Your book talks about the development of Christian yellow pages, the development of the whole sort of Christian culture. Where Christian, this is probably a good thing to put up here. The word Christian, like when you think about Christian music or Christian bookstores, what does it really mean? It means evangelical Christians, for the most part. Your book then also talks about Hal Lindsey. And again, if this were like 10, 15 years ago, you guys probably would know who he is because you'd have seen his books in used bookstores or mentioned from time to time. He's really become just a historical footnote now. He wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And you remember we talked about dispensational pre-milleniarism, this notion that the end of the world is coming and you can kind of correlate the end of the world and the predictions about it in the book of Revelations and the book of Daniel to actual real-world events. You guys remember all that sort of stuff? So it was very popular to do that in the 1970s and 1980s in terms of what Reagan later called the evil empire. And what was that? Exactly. And their allies, the Warsaw Pact. And so, the Battle of Armageddon was supposed to be us squaring off against the Soviets, probably in Israel or something like that. Well, it's hard to make those sort of correlations after the Soviet Union falls. Then it's got to be China, or maybe Iran, or pick whoever else you want. The Left Behind series, that'd be a more contemporary example of this kind of apocalyptic literature making its way into the popular culture. Have any of you read the Left Behind books? Those are in that same sort of genre. So we're going to come back to culture when we get to New Church structure in a few minutes. I'm going to run really quickly, because we don't have a hell of a lot of time, through talking about politics and the religious right. What do we mean when we talk about the religious right? Does that equal, say, Republicans? It's a good question to answer. The Republicans are the conservative party, the Democrats are the liberal party, right? If we're very broadly speaking at this time. Does that mean that all Republicans are religious? No. Are all people who are conservative and religious Republicans? As a matter of fact, they sometimes, you could say that if you guys remember Venn diagrams from like logic classes. So here's Republicans, and here's conservatives, and here's traditional Christians. They don't always coincide with each other. And part of what you have to do if you're a political party and you actually want to win elections is you have to find ways to like pull things into your spot, your Venn diagram spot. The Republicans do this and the Democrats do this very well. That's why they're the two dominant parties. Nobody else really does a good job at that. That's a long conversation why that's the case. In general, in the 1980s and the 1990s, you could say that there was a strong alignment between traditional Christians, conservative Christians, and the Republican Party. And it actually went down through churches as well. Churches that don't have an explicitly political bent like the Catholic Church, where it's really split, Democrat, Republican. The more conservative Catholics voted for Bush overwhelmingly. The more liberal Catholics voted for Kerry or voted for Gore, if you look at those two elections. So there's a number of different issues that your book talks about, and we'll just mention a few of them. Like, the gay rights issue is a huge one right now. But what were some of the other bigger issues before that? Abortion, that's a perennial issue that comes up. What else? Worry about what they call secularization or secular humanism. That was a big concern back in the 1980s. Family patterns, what is poverty caused by? All these sorts of things. They all get tied up in the political field. And what we've seen in recent elections is that conservative Christians seem to be getting less and less happy with the Republicans, but they don't really have anywhere else to go, because the Democratic Party doesn't appeal to them very well. It espouses a number of positions that they tend to find repugnant, like, supporting abortion or, that sort of stuff. But the Republicans don't seem to be particularly good at delivering on this, and many of the Republicans seem to be willing to sort of gloss over that. So it's kind of an open question right now. Is there a religious right? What's going to happen with the religious right? We're no longer in the same condition that we were back in the 1980s and 90s, where there was a very strong alignment, where, you might say that it was more like this, that the Republicans have managed to capture a lot of the religious votes. Last thing I want to hit on very quickly, and I'm just going to throw words up here rather than explain them because we don't have a lot of time. I'll just do 3. What's televangelism? It's got kind of a bad name. The book mentions a lot of the scandals that took place in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s. What is televangelism? It's still around today. If you flip around the channel, those of you that do still watch cable TV, you'll come across some televangelizing channels. It's sort of like what Billy Graham was doing with the radio, only with TV. And a lot of them will, it's very, it's got its own sort of style to it. I guess that's probably enough to say about this. We could probably talk about more later on. What's a megachurch? What does that mean?
A massive, huge building.
Yeah, okay. So giant building, yeah.
They're so big that they need TV screens in order for the people in the back to see the pastor.
There's actually one that's talked about in the book, not in this chapter, but another one that has, you can park your car. And just like with drive-in movie theaters, you can listen to the sermon on your radio. That's pretty huge. Now, why do people go to these mega churches? They find something relevant there. It tends to be more contemporary music, a lot of media techniques. These have become pretty big. Most of them were in the South, but there's one that's in Chicago that's been there for a long time. And these draw quite a few. A lot of these are actually connected with what we call the new paradigm. And this is what we'll end with. So when you talk about a new paradigm, what do you mean? We have a new paradigm for marketing. We have a new way of thinking about it. New paradigm churches were designed to reach out to remember this term we've used before, the unchurched, the people who weren't getting their needs met by traditional religion. And they would do market analyses and try to figure out how can we actually bring the unchurched, who are mostly younger people, how can we make Christianity relevant to them? So some of that is connected with the megachurch phenomenon. A lot of this will be smaller, non-denominational churches, or it'll be like vineyard churches, contemporary music, very contemporary service. I would be overdressed at a church like that, even to be preaching. Everything's supposed to be very informal. So, all right.